You were told he was a punchline. The mask, the glove, the strange press conferences, the headlines that seem to get stranger every single year. That is the version of Michael Jackson most people carry around without ever questioning it. He became the go-to example of a celebrity who had simply lost touch with reality, a cautionary tale you laugh about rather than actually examine. But strip away the tabloid framing for a moment, and a very different picture starts to form underneath it. Because buried inside the parts of his life that got mocked the hardest were warnings about the music industry, about how fame actually works behind the curtain, about how the media decides who gets to be believed and who gets written off as unstable before anyone even checks the facts. Warnings almost nobody in power wanted to hear at the time, delivered by a man who was ridiculed for saying them out loud. Stick around, because by the end of this you will understand exactly what he was trying to tell the world, and why it took the rest of us roughly 20 years to catch up to him. The childhood that was sold before he could choose it. Gary, Indiana, late 1960s. A steel town, a cramped house, and a father who ran rehearsals like military drills. Michael Jackson was 5 years old when he started performing, and by the time most kids were learning to ride a bike, he was already the lead singer of a professional group being groomed for Motown. Berry Gordy did not sign the Jackson 5 because they were cute. He signed them because Michael, barely out of kindergarten, could already outsing grown men, copying the phrasing of James Brown and Jackie Wilson with a precision that adult musicians in the room found unsettling to watch from someone so small. By 1970, the Jackson 5 had 4 consecutive #1 singles, a feat almost no group before them had managed straight out of the gate. That success came from real, demonstrated talent. But it also came at a cost that rarely made the press releases: a childhood run on a strict schedule of rehearsals, performances, and discipline, with almost no room left over for simply being a child. Michael would say later in interviews that he often felt like he was working a full-time adult job before he had lived enough of a life to understand what he was giving up. He talked about watching other kids play outside through a studio window while he was expected to nail another vocal take. He talked about a father whose idea of motivation leaned heavily on fear rather than encouragement, and about how performing became something closer to a job requirement than a source of joy long before he was old enough to consent to that trade-off. None of this stopped the hits from coming. If anything, the discipline sharpened him into one of the most technically gifted performers of his generation by the time he was still a teenager. But the price tag on that skill set was a childhood that had already been spent before he understood what he had lost. This detail matters, because it sets up everything that follows. The same industry that benefited from that sacrifice would later be the one deciding how his adult life got framed in public. A kid who was never really allowed to be a kid grew into a man the world expected to behave like an ordinary adult, with no real map for how to do that. Keep that origin in mind, because it is going to resurface later in ways that most coverage of him conveniently left out. It is worth pausing on just how young 5 years old actually is. At an age when most children are learning their alphabet, Michael was already being coached on stage presence, breath control, and how to hold a note in front of paying audiences. Motown was a hit-making machine, and machines do not slow down for childhood. The same relentless work ethic that made him one of the most technically skilled performers in history was instilled in him before he had any real say in the matter, which is exactly the kind of origin story that earns credibility in hindsight, even though almost nobody was asking whether it was fair to him at the time. The purchase that made Wall Street laugh at him. Fast forward to the 1980s. Thriller becomes the best-selling album in history. Michael sweeps the Grammys, and his short films redefine what a music video could even be. Quincy Jones, one of the most respected producers in the industry, called him one of the most disciplined and instinctive artists he had ever worked with. That credibility mattered because it set up a business decision in 1985 that almost nobody understood at the time. Michael Jackson purchased the ATV Music Publishing catalog, which included the rights to most of the Beatles' songwriting catalog, for a reported $47.5 million. Industry insiders at the time treated it as an odd, almost frivolous move by a pop star with too much money. Financial reporters openly questioned why a performer would spend that kind of fortune on paperwork and publishing rights instead of something flashier. Decades later, that catalog would be valued at several $100 million, and it is now looked back on as one of the smartest music business decisions of the 20th century. He understood something the rest of the industry didn't yet, that owning your masters and Owning the songs themselves was where the real, lasting power lived, not just in chart positions or awards. Every time an artist today negotiates to keep their own masters or re-records old albums specifically to regain control of their work, they are chasing the exact same insight. Michael Jackson acted on back in 1985, while the finance pages quietly wondered if he had lost his business sense. This was also the era where the credibility case for him was airtight. Quincy Jones, a producer with decades of respect behind names like Frank Sinatra and Ray Charles, called him one of the most instinctive and disciplined artists he had ever worked with in the studio. Thriller swept the Grammys in 1984, taking home a record-setting haul that still stands as one of the biggest single-night hauls in the show's history. The Guinness Book of World Records eventually recognized Thriller as the best-selling album ever made. None of that credibility came from luck. It came from thousands of hours in the studio and a level of perfectionism that people who worked with him described as almost obsessive. That is the foundation the story is built on: a serious, respected, hard-working artist who was about to be treated very differently once he stopped playing along quietly. It is easy to forget, looking back through the lens of tabloid headlines, just how methodical he was as a businessman during this period. He studied contracts. He understood distribution. He negotiated deals that gave him more creative control over his own short films than almost any artist of his era. None of that fits the later caricature of an erratic, disconnected celebrity. It fits the profile of someone who paid close attention to the mechanics of the industry long before he ever stood up in public and criticized them. If you're noticing a pattern here, a man dismissed in his own time who turns out to have been years ahead of it, that pattern is exactly what this channel is built around. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next story where history quietly proves someone right. The press conference that got him called unstable. In 2002, Michael Jackson stood in front of cameras alongside civil rights figures and said something most artists were far too afraid to say out loud. He accused his own record label, and specifically Sony executive Tommy Mottola, of exploiting black artists, manipulating contracts, and undervaluing musicians who had generated enormous profits for the company. He described the modern record industry as, in his own words, deeply unfair and outdated in how it treated the very people who created its wealth in the first place. The response was swift, and it was not kind. Major outlets framed him as unhinged, calling the accusations paranoid and the press conference an embarrassing meltdown rather than a serious business complaint. Very few headlines engaged with the substance of what he was actually saying about contracts, royalty rates, or the long, well-documented history of artists being underpaid relative to what labels earned off their work. Instead, the story became about his behavior, his appearance, and his mental state, anything except the claim itself. He did not walk it back. Despite the ridicule, Michael kept making the same point in later interviews, that artists, especially black artists, were treated as products to be squeezed rather than people to be paid fairly for the value they created. It cost him relationships with his own label soured further, and the unstable label that got attached to him after that press conference followed him into coverage of nearly everything he did for years afterward. He said it anyway on camera with his name attached, at a moment when almost no other artist of his stature was willing to risk that kind of backlash from the people who controlled their careers. Convicted by headlines long before any verdict existed. By the mid-2000s, Michael Jackson was facing serious criminal allegations, and the media treated the accusations as settled fact almost from the first news cycle. Magazine covers, nightly news segments, and late-night monologues all but delivered a verdict months before the actual trial began. Reporters camped outside the courthouse for weeks, and the coverage often blurred the line between reporting what was alleged and simply assuming what was true. In 2005, a jury heard the evidence over several months of testimony and acquitted him on every single count. That acquittal barely slowed the narrative that had already been built around him for years. The personal cost was enormous. Friends and biographers described a man who grew more isolated with each passing year, increasingly guarded around a public that had already made up its mind long before any courtroom got involved. His health visibly declined under the strain of non-stop scrutiny, and people close to him described someone who trusted almost no one by the end, having watched his own words and choices get twisted into headlines again and again. The version of him that dominated the press, strange, reclusive, untrustworthy, became almost impossible to separate from the person underneath it, even for people who had known him for decades. What makes this stretch of the story so uncomfortable in hindsight is how little space there was, at the time, for nuance. A person could be acquitted by a full jury after months of testimony and still be treated by headlines as guilty in spirit, simply because the accusation itself had already done its damage. That gap between what a courtroom determines and what a headline implies is exactly the kind of gap that later generations of public figures would learn to fear, often citing his case as the moment they realized reputation could be destroyed by an accusation alone, regardless of what a jury eventually decided. It is a pattern that should sound familiar today. A public figure gets tried by media coverage and public opinion long before any court, journalist, or jury has actually finished examining the facts. We now have a name for it: trial by internet, or the harsher edges of cancel culture. But Michael Jackson was living through an early, brutal version of it well before the term existed. Stories like this, the ones where the public narrative and the actual facts turn out to be two very different things, are the kind of thing you want more of. Subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one lands in your feed. The condition everyone mocked until they finally understood it. There is another piece of this that rarely gets its own moment in the story, and it deserves one. For years, the public and the press treated the visible lightening of Michael Jackson's skin as proof of some deep personal insecurity, joking that he was trying to erase his own identity. It became one of the most repeated punchlines about him in an era before the underlying medical reality was widely understood or taken seriously by the public. Michael said plainly in interviews that he had vitiligo, a real autoimmune condition that causes patches of skin to lose pigment, and that the changes people saw were the result of a medical condition and the treatments used to manage it, not a personal choice about identity. At the time, that explanation was treated with suspicion by much of the press. It took years and a great deal of broader public education about autoimmune skin conditions before vitiligo became something the culture recognized and respected rather than mocked. Today it is discussed openly, including by other public figures who have the same condition, in a way that simply was not available to him when he needed it most. A similar pattern shows up with the surgical masks, the gloves, and the careful hand sanitizing that late-night hosts turned into a running joke for over a decade. It was treated as one more sign of eccentricity from a man who had supposedly lost the plot. Then a global pandemic arrived, and mask-wearing, hand sanitizing, and careful avoidance of crowded spaces became standard advice from health officials worldwide. The behavior did not change. Only the culture's willingness to take it seriously did. The world that finally caught up to what he was saying. Look at the music industry today, and you'll find artists publicly fighting to reclaim ownership of their own masters, calling out exploitative deals, and demanding transparency from labels. The exact fight Michael Jackson picked in 2002 while being told he sounded delusional for picking it. Every time a major artist re-records old material just to regain control of it, or walks away from a label over unfair terms, that fight traces straight back to the argument he made on camera while reporters mocked his delivery instead of his math. Look at the wave of documentaries and public reckonings around how child stars were treated by the industry that raised them, and you'll find the same warning he gave about his own upbringing. Decades earlier, back when audiences preferred the polished version of the Jackson 5 story to the exhausting reality behind it. Look at the growing discomfort with how quickly the media convicts public figures before all the facts are in, and you'll find his name mentioned again and again as one of the earliest, most visible examples of exactly that damage. A man tried and effectively sentenced by magazine covers years before an actual jury ever weighed in, and largely forgotten again the moment that jury cleared him. None of this rewrites what happened in his life, and none of it is meant to. But it does complicate the flattened, tabloid version of him that most people settled for without ever double-checking it. He bought what nobody else valued at the time. He said what nobody else in his position was willing to say out loud. And he lived through a version of public judgment that the rest of the culture is only now starting to properly reckon with. The mask and the headlines were never the whole story. The warnings were there the entire time. We simply weren't ready to listen, and if this is the kind of story you want more of, the subscribe button is right there, waiting for you to. Make sure you don't miss the next one.